Usually when people ask me what are some of the major differences in between the US and Sweden, I either will tell them public transport, public healthcare, or I'll say something that is kind of off-putting like, "Oh, my children don't die here." Um but I wanted to do a video about some of the actual major differences. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are still other things that I can talk about later, but just some of the differences in experience that I've had from living in the US and Sweden. So the first differences are incredibly obvious. They are public healthcare and they are public transportation. But I want to talk more about why those things aren't available in the US when people have worked to make them available in the US. Let's talk about public transport first. For some reason, and I think it has something to do with how we treat people who ride public transport in the US, but the US does not respect public transport. There's a lot of mythology around like, well, if you work, you will have a car. If you have a, you should have a car. Every good American has a car, blah, 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 blah. And part of that is because of advertisement. And part of that is because of the fact that most cities aren't walkable, which I've talked about before. And the fact that most cities are built towards cars more than anything else. Drive-throughs, parking lots, lack of sidewalks, all of that. But it's also that we make fun of people who ride public transport. The kids who ride the bus to school get made fun of. The people who have to take a train to go somewhere, generally, unless you live in a big city, if you ride public transport, you are made fun of. Whereas in most of the rest of the world, especially in Europe and especially in Sweden, public transport is nice. In the US, because we don't have places for our homeless or our mentally ill because of a bunch of stuff that happened in the 80s. If you guys want a history lesson, let me know. I'll be happy to talk about how Ronald Reagan ruined the world when I was a kid. But there's plenty of TV shows about it too. But a lot of people who are mentally ill or homeless don't have a place to be. And those people, when they don't have any sort of control over any aspect of their life, they will do anything to feel like they have control, even if that is shitting in a public place, even if that is falling asleep in a public place where other people are trying to sleep, even if it's pissing on the seats, whatever they can do to feel like they have some modicum of control in their life, they can do that. And so a lot of public transport in the US is just unpleasant. It's just not nice. Whereas in Sweden, I've seen people crack open a book. I've seen people drink. Everything is so incredibly clean and incredibly smooth, at least down here in Skåne, that like when I went to the UK, who is famous for their public transport, I was like, this isn't as nice as Sweden. And I caught myself being bougie for a second. And I was just like, oh, wow, that was some bullshit right there. But no, Sweden has very, very nice public transport and it's accessible to everybody. And it's cheap. That's huge. Public healthcare, I can't tell you how much it changes your soul to not have to worry that you're not going to be able to afford healthcare. I can't tell you how much of a weight off of your shoulders it is to know that if somebody in your family gets sick, you can do something about it. And yes, it doesn't happen quite as fast in Sweden as some people want, but it is always an option here. Whereas in the sorry, having trouble with my phone. In the US, I have known people who have died because they put off healthcare until things got better, or because they didn't want to deal with the hassle, or they didn't want to enter into debt for the rest of their lives. So I've known several people who have died because they put something off too long and it got septic, and they just, by the time they went to the doctor for an emergency, they were unable to do that. Also, healthcare isn't available everywhere. And it's one of those things where a lot of poor people just are not able to get Technically, we were supposed to fix that with the thing that people call Obamacare. It's actually called the Affordable Care Act. But lots of states made that really hard to get and defunded it to such a point where it's not available for everybody like it was supposed to be. And those states are almost always the states who desperately need it because they have a shit ton of poor people. Almost all the red states are deficits on the federal budget. And almost all the blue states are giving money to the red states to support their poor people, even though those poor people vote the other way most often. Anyway, whole different thing, politics. When we moved here, we didn't have a car for the first several years, so we got very used to taking public transport. It was still very hard for us to call into work because we felt guilty about it, because in the US, we have a culture that makes you feel guilty about calling into work. As teachers, we're given 10 days off in the US for the whole year, and you tended to sit on those just in case you got sick. And the thing is, even if you get cancer, even if you get hit by a car, even if you get whatever horrible thing can happen to you, you still only have 10 days off. And then after that, you don't get paid, which is a huge difference. I'm going to talk about one more depressing one, and then we'll talk about some of the more fun ones. The one more depressing one is I did have several students die in the US while they were my students. And then several more after I had left. I also had several students go to prison for life while I was still in the US, which was heartbreaking. Not nearly as much concern about my students being driven to starve or driven to crime here in Sweden. I've talked before about how crime seems to be mostly a boredom thing here. Whereas in the US, it's almost always a desperation thing, at least among the poor people that I knew. But yeah, so I don't have to worry about my students coming to school and not being able to concentrate because they haven't eaten in 20 hours or whatever, which was a regular problem back in the US. I would buy these crates of peanut butter crackers, cheese and crackers, and when a student was unable to focus because they were starving, I would toss that at them and they would eat in class, even though it was against the law or against the rules for them to eat in class. You are dirty. Why are you here? Okay. Lady Stinky Butt. So, other things about the US that are very different in Sweden, odd little things, and these are cuter or funnier, but some of them have dark reasonings. In the US, there are a lot more random lost animals, wild animals, packs of dogs sometimes, packs of cats, just random groups of pets. Reminded of that because of Violet. Yeah, there are a lot of just homeless animals in the US because people will not take care of their animals or they'll just run off and they won't go, find them. That's not a problem here in Sweden. Grocery stores were open 24/7. Most shops were open. There were any place that was general access where the people got paid minimum wage. Mostly were open really, really late, like sandwich shops, and there were several 24-hour places where you could go. There were lots of choices for midnight food or food at 2 a.m. I understand that may have changed during the pandemic. But before the pandemic, I lived in college town. There were 15 restaurants that I could get food from at 2 in the morning. There were 2 pizza places, 1 Chinese place, 3 Mexican food places, and then just like McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Jack in the Box, Taco Bell. All of those places. So, and Taco Bell is not one of the Mexican food places I was talking about because Taco Bell is not Mexican food. The work-life balance is dramatically different. Sweden, you are forced to have time off. You are not able to work the long hours that in the US are absolutely normal. The lack of hustle culture was a huge deal for me. Because in the US, there is a drive to constantly be working, to constantly be doing something that you can sell. So like when you're at your job, you're probably doing another job too. Sam was always doing art to supplement our finances. But she did not, and we were desperate. We needed it. We were both had full-time jobs, and we were still barely able to keep up with rent and utilities and stuff like that, and student loans. Free education is a huge thing that is different over here. The fact that anybody can go back to school anytime they want, that's massive. The lack of dead-end jobs in the U.S. If you work at Walmart later than your 20s, you're probably stuck there forever. You will probably never do anything else ever. Same thing with several fast food places. You'll become manager and then you'll just get stuck. Whereas over here in Sweden, I've known several people who were like, yeah, I decided to work at ICA for a little while, and then I decided to just go back to college and become an astrophysicist or whatever. And it's one of those things where it's like in the US, working at a grocery store, dead-end job. In Sweden, there really aren't dead-end jobs. Like you can support a family and work at ICA, and that's no big deal. In the US, that's not how it works at all. And so that's a huge, huge difference. The lack of urgency. I have found that in Sweden, you don't freak out when something goes wrong because there's almost always a way for it to get better. Like in the US, if a bus doesn't come, then you worry because the next one might not come, the next one might not come, the next one might not come. So in Sweden, if a bus doesn't come, then the next one comes 10 minutes later or 15 minutes later or 20 minutes later. So that's new and weird for me personally. Being able to walk everywhere was a huge deal. Like when the buses, when it's a Sunday and the buses only come once an hour in our little town of Landskrona, being able to just walk to the grocery store, huge. Amazing. Wonderful. Although our nightmare for that first 2 years, and still occasionally a nightmare, is having to chase fit Swedes. Because even though I was the fast walker in the US, I was the one who was always leaving people behind because I walked too fast. I walk at the same cadence as Swedes do. In other words, our feet hit the ground at the same time. But somehow Swedes are just faster. And so quite often they'll be like, okay, follow me, and then just take off. And they'll walk like 2 kilometers. And we're able to keep up now. We're able to keep up breath-wise, and we're fit enough to where we can walk for 2 kilometers. That's new too. But the fact that people just go, it's not far, boom, and take off, that's completely different than in the US. Completely different from what we are used to. Education is completely different here. Jobs are completely different here. We don't have anything like fika in the US. The closest we have is like cigarette breaks. Also, it's kind of weird because cigarettes were so frowned upon in the US. Moving over here to Sweden, it feels like way more people smoke here than do in the US. But less people do drugs. Like you do not smell marijuana nearly as often. I smell it like every couple of weeks in the apartment complex I live in because I got neighbors and that's how it works. But like in the US, you would walk outside the school and you would smell marijuana, and over here not nearly as much. The lack of crime by comparison, a lot of people in Sweden think that Sweden is incredibly dangerous, and I'll talk about that on another video with all the research that I've done on it, because there were a bunch of racist people who were trying to tell me that the crime was all immigrant related, and it's not. But that's a whole different video. I'll do a whole video about it. But the fact that Sweden is so fucking safe by comparison to the US is just amazing. I never have to worry about my students coming at me with guns or knives. And even if a student tried to beat me up, which I have not yet met a student that I'm afraid of in Sweden, even if they did, how badly could they really hurt me in a place with healthcare? Unless there's a curb stomp involved. So for the most part, I'm not as worried about physical violence here in Sweden, dramatically so as a teacher. But even more so just because physical violence isn't nearly as prevalent. So safety and security is a big thing for difference between things. Um, let's see. The cheese is different here. The sweets are different. Chocolate is very, very different over here. But I miss melty cheese. Now, in the back of my mind, I recognize that in the US, we quite often had edible plastic that was cheese flavored. And people hear that and they think, oh no, you're eating plastic. What I mean is plastic is an adjective, like glutinous. Glutinous means stuck together, sticky. So when somebody's like talking about gluten, that literally just means the thing that makes sticky. So when I say plastic, I mean the cheese there is a chemical thing that makes it act like plastic. It's not like actual petroleum products. It's just you turn it into this thing that lasts longer and that melts evenly, and it's fucking magic. In Sweden, if you try to melt cheese, you have to be very, very gradual about it. In the US, you stick Velveeta in the microwave for a minute and a half, you got cheese dip. And I miss cheese dip so much. My wife has occasionally made it over here, but the texture's all wrong. It's all wrong. You have to make a fucking fondue to have cheese dip over here. And then you got beer in your cheese, and who wants that really? Now I want fondue. Okay. Anyway, let's see. So food is very different over here. It tastes a little less good, and part of that is the sugar, which is definitely true. But also now, like, my ability to consume sugar is dramatically different. Like, if I have an American food somewhere, like if I go to Fridays or something where they have very American food, it puts me to sleep. I go in, I have almost an immediate sugar crash. Every now and then people would send us Pop-Tarts from the US because we used to like Pop-Tarts. And I had Pop-Tarts as breakfast one morning before I went to school, and I was falling asleep at 9 a.m. And I'd gotten plenty of sleep. It was such a sugar crash. In the US, we eat almost nothing but sugar for breakfast. So like donuts, perfectly normal breakfast in the US. We put sugar in everything. And I talked about in my other video about the fat people, about why our sugar is so much worse than yours. But also our meat is much, much worse than yours. My wife couldn't eat American beef for a long time because it's of such low quality. There's so much extra junk in there. Whereas in Sweden, she can eat beef just fine because you guys' beef is a higher quality. You hide it to a higher standard. That's important. The health and safety that is tied to that. And a lot of this is like based on the fact that everything is for sale in the US. So we have these lobbies that make it to where it's perfectly fine to do things that are bad for people as long as you warn them. And you don't even really have to warn them much. McDonald's has a smaller menu here. Almost every American place has a smaller menu here. McDonald's has significantly more options in the US. I do occasionally miss breakfast biscuits, which is not a thing you guys have over here. I don't miss McGriddles, which are basically like sausage in between pancakes. Those things, they smell really good. They don't taste that good. Pizza Hut has thin crust in the US, and it is so fucking good. Imagine like if you had a Swedish pizza, but instead of it being floppy, so like when you're holding the thing, it goes bleh. If instead of doing that, if it was like cardboard texture where it held it up, And it tastes it tastes like I imagine you guys think Kaneka bread tastes. So like Kaneka bread, but with like sauce and cheese and pepperoni, and now I want pizza. It is almost lunchtime, thank God. Let's see. Other weird things. Oh, you're much less likely to get run over in Sweden because you can just walk out in the street and that's safe here. In the US, people will run you the fuck down. If you're riding a bike on a street in the US, people will run you down and claim it was your fault for being on the street. That's a thing that's real. You don't worry about, there's so many things you don't have to worry about. And it's one of those things where it seems like that's no big deal, but the privilege of not having to think about, like, if my wife gets sick in 3 months, will I have enough money to pay for her to go to the doctor? That's fucking huge. That's just ridiculous big. So it's hard to explain how much that changes you. I'm trying to think. These are all the big things. There's a bunch of little things that I could do individual videos about, like food differences or safety differences or how people think differences. The racism over here is pervasive, but not as dangerous. You guys aren't as violent in your opinions. You might still be racist, but you're less likely to actually go hurt black people or hurt Hispanic people or hurt Arabic people. For the most part. There are a couple of people who are still, given the power of their convictions, still monstrously racist. There are gay and trans people are not in like imminent danger here. That was a thing in the US. That is a thing in the US. Women are significantly safer here. Significantly more safe. It's harder to find friendly people. In the US, there were a lot of friendly people. In Texas, specifically, there were a lot of friendly people everywhere. You could meet people at the grocery store and be friends with them. You could meet people at the library and like strike up a conversation and immediately become friends. And then like see those people the next week and then a month later be in their wedding. People are much friendlier over there. People are much more open to being friendly over there. It's one of those things where you would see it in movies where like somebody goes, hey, and they'll start talking in a restaurant and they'll be like, yeah, pull up a chair, sit down. And that's really how it is in Texas. It really is. You can make friends in the middle of a dinner. And that's just not something you can do in Sweden. People are way, way, way too many social boundaries here. The etiquette is a lot different here. There's a lot of things that you don't do. You don't call people ma'am and sir. That's a absolutely normal thing in Texas. Like literally everybody is addressed by an honorific, and that's gotten way more difficult with people not being necessarily ma'am and sir. But it's one of those things where it's worth it to call people what they are. It's worth it for people to feel comfortable, but it is difficult when you are trying to make a judgment based entirely on appearance and entirely on a guess, because it's very hard to know how people identify. In Sweden, you don't have that problem. But I do have a lot of problems with like students giving me trouble when I'm like folks or kids or students or my students. They'll be like, we're not children. And I'm like, fine, you're not children. Some of you are acting like children right now. But yeah, whatever. So collective nouns are harder in Sweden because it's hard to group people without them taking it very, very seriously. Like calling my kids Swedes. You guys don't call your teachers by their first and last name. You don't call them by their last name. I've done videos about that. It's based on the honorific bullshit and respect. I did major videos about differences in education, which was my field in the U.S. I don't know very much about your prisons, but they're very different than Texas prisons. Let's see. Your hotels are about the same, from what I can tell. I worked in hotels for 18 years, and the hotels over here are pretty much the same. Except they probably are a little less exploitive over here because they're required by law to not be as exploitive. I think that's all the major ones. I'll have to think about it, and I'll write down a list of all the major differences, and I'll try to do a better video. But this is the non-exhaustive list of things that are very, very different between Sweden and Texas.